Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Orla and I'm delighted to be joined by Lisa Clark from Dell Technologies in the UK, who will present the topic Azure is hybrid by design. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC22. Don't forget to check out the Resource Centre. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. Continue your Azure learning by joining us again tomorrow for a webinar called Azure Static Web Apps Hit the Ground Running by Rick van der Bosch from BetaBit in the Netherlands. Find out more at sharepointeurope.com/Azure-week. Deep dive into topics of your choice with the ESPC22 tutorials. Experience a full-day expert-led workshop on the SharePoint framework, search, security, AI, hybrid work, Azure Arc, Microsoft 365 or Microsoft Viva. Find out more at sharepointeurope.com/ESPC22-tutorials. Our ESPC22 early bird sale is now on. Save €200 on 3- and 4-day tickets. Find out more at sharepointeurope.com. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question you have in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you will be notified by email when it's available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our presenter, Lisa. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, hello.
Hey,
Let
Lisa.
me just show my screen. Awesome.
Perfect. We can see it now.
Excellent. So we're good to go. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me for this session to present all about Azure and how it's hybrid by design. There's a lot going on in the hybrid Azure space just now. Azure Inspire that's happening today and yesterday have had a number of announcements. There's a lot going on, and sometimes it's necessary to take a step back and actually just have an overview as to how Azure is hybrid by design, and that's what I'm hoping to do today. So first up, very quick introduction about myself. I am a Microsoft MVP based in Dundee, Scotland, sunniest city in Scotland, definitely one of the hottest places in Scotland over the last few days. Thankfully, it's cooled down. I've been in the IT industry for over 10 years. Very, very passionate about enabling customers and everyone really to understand and harness the benefits of cloud and kind of cut through a lot of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that so often appears in marketing around the cloud. Back in 2020, I kicked off a podcast called Lisa at the Edge. It's been a little bit quiet this year since restrictions lifted. I've been focusing on life away from the desk. And yeah, I'm not actually techie. I actually have a law degree. So there you go. That's a little bit about me. So today we're going to take a look at, first of all, why hybrid? Why hybrid and a little bit of why multi-cloud. We're going to look at Azure and how it's hybrid by design, and a little bit of how Azure is slightly different from maybe GCP and AWS. We're going to look at the two mechanisms which Microsoft sort of uses or utilizes to deliver hybrid capabilities. So we're going to take a look at what is Azure Stack HCI and what is Azure Arc. And we're going to keep it quite high level. Like I say, there's a lot going on in this space. Some of it's been around for a little while, but it's still very new to most people. So we're going to take a step back and we're going to get the lay of the land when it comes to Azure and hybrids. So first up then, let's just sort of talk about why hybrid. Both these next two slides are actually Microsoft slides. So Microsoft themselves recognize that hybrid and multi-cloud is something that many organizations need and are interested in. And I think this is because Microsoft and Azure differ from AWS and GCP in that they grew up in the enterprise, much like Dell Technologies, who I work for, much like our customers. They grew up in the enterprise, they grew up in the on-premises space, and so I think they have a real grasp on the complexities and the requirements of that space. And so Here you can see from a Gartner report and a Flexera report, 90% of enterprises depend on hybrid, and 93% of enterprises have a multi-cloud strategy, which is quite interesting. And what are the reasons for the need? Why is there a need for hybrid and multi-cloud? And there's a few of these, and you've probably heard of all of them, if not most of them. First up, we know that not all workloads can be moved to the public cloud, quite often due to regulatory and data sovereignty requirements. Azure is actually one of the most compliant cloud. It is the most compliant cloud out there, actually. It has over 90 certifications, and Microsoft spend over 1 billion per year on security. But a lot of the ISO accreditations and audits, etc., sometimes haven't caught up with the technology that's available today, but sometimes they really do require data to remain in a certain physical boundary or in a certain country or region or within certain bounds, and therefore it just can't be moved to the public cloud. And we see this as being super common in highly regulated industries, as you would imagine, financial, healthcare, local government. Next up is low latency and edge workloads. So we cannot yet break the speed of light, and so latency matters. And this is tightly coupled with the first point there. Often wherever data needs to reside, it has this gravity pull on the applications and workloads that interact with the data, and therefore they need to remain close to the data, which means they might also have to remain on premises or at the edge. Next up, many companies and organizations have made significant investments in their infrastructure that they're running in their data centers, and they want to make the most of that. And they have applications in there which can't move for reasons potentially that we've just mentioned, and they want to enhance and modernize those the best they can. More and more, we're seeing organizations become more comfortable with using the cloud as a destination for business continuity, so backup, using Azure Site Recovery for DR, etc. And then this last point here is pretty interesting. So freedom to use more than one public cloud. And remember, I said that these are Microsoft slides. This is an interesting point, and we'll come on to this. So let's talk then about how Azure is hybrid by design. So if we were to cast our minds back to maybe 7, maybe 8 years ago, Azure's been around for longer than then, but if we think back to 6, 7, 8 years ago, if you were to attend any Microsoft event or listen to any Microsoft executives, stand up on stage at these events, they would very much say, Azure is the destination for all workloads. Move your workloads to Azure. They would say, we have more regions than AWS and Google combined, and that's still true today. They still have more regions than AWS and Google combined. But it's very much that, this is the destination for all workloads. It's the future. This is where you need to go. And it made sense, right? Because that they'd entered the public cloud world. They were competing against Amazon, for instance. They had to drive that business. But the tune has changed, and so if you've listened to any of the more recent events, like Microsoft Inspire that's happening today, you will see a big theme there. It's changed, right? The messaging has changed. And although Azure will sometimes and very often be the best place for workloads, it's not always the case. And so now the emphasis is on allowing and enabling customers and businesses to innovate anywhere, wherever it makes the most commercial sense for them, wherever it makes the most sense for their workloads and those requirements. So that could be in the cloud, but it could also be on premises or at the edge. So it's wherever it really makes sense for the workloads to run. Microsoft and Azure are really focused on meeting their customers and their workloads where they are. And so the focus has changed. The focus has changed to really developing and creating Azure services and enabling them to be taken advantage of anywhere. So no longer does Azure just equate to an Azure data center. We all know cloud is not a location, it is a way of working, but this really kind of makes that really quite literal and kind of helps us think about what that actually means in practical terms. And so, yeah, Microsoft are very, very much now focused on bringing Azure services and governance and management capability to workloads wherever they reside. So I have been delivering a presentation in this kind of format or around this topic now for the last year and maybe a half, since really in anger since Azure Stack HCI was launched. And I've broken this down to be really simple. This is, like I said, remember, this is high level, this is overview, it's taking a step back, getting a lay of the land when it comes to Azure Hybrid. So I've said there that, you know, Microsoft are focused on bringing Azure capability and services to workloads wherever they need to run. How do they do this? What does it look like? So it's via two mechanisms, and the first mechanism is the Azure Stack Portfolio, which currently contains 3 offerings today. The second mechanism is Azure Arc, which is all about extending Azure governance and management and capabilities to workloads, you know, virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters running outside of Azure today. And so we're going to take a little moment here to just look at each of these aspects, and then we're going to dive into Azure Stack HCI and Azure Arc in more detail. So first up then, let's take a look at the Azure Stack portfolio, and I'm going to talk about Azure Stack Edge first of all. This product is a Microsoft first-party product. What do I mean by that? I mean that you log onto the Azure portal and you consume it directly from Microsoft. So it's a 1U server with GPU capability, and its use case is very specific. It's focused on, as you can imagine, edge workloads. It's focused on AI and ML scenarios at the edge, very much for image and video inferencing at the edge. You want to do that, again, where the data is, where you're collecting the data. You don't want to be you know, sending data up to the cloud, waiting for it to come back, incurring those charges, as well as, you know, not getting your results instantly. And so that's what it's for, and you need to manage it directly from the Azure portal as well. Like I said, 1U server, GPU capability, very specific use case. Azure Stack Hub. Azure Stack Hub was the first product in the portfolio, formerly known as Azure Stack, caused all manners of complications when Microsoft renamed Azure Stack to Azure Stack Hub, turned it into a portfolio. But Azure Stack Hub, again, is a product with a very specific use case. It is for customers who want to take advantage of Azure, and when I say Azure, I mean the Azure portal, the Azure Marketplace, Azure PaaS services, Azure Resource Manager. They want to bring that on premises. They almost want to run their own Azure region. It's for very specific use cases where customers can't be connected to the internet or to Azure, or they have to operate in hostile environments. It's a really, really cool product, but it has a very specific use case. It's a co-engineered appliance. So for instance, Dell and Microsoft co-engineer Azure Stack Hub, and it's delivered as a sort of black box. The management looks very different from a traditional virtualized environment. So with Azure Stack Hub, you have to be comfortable with managing the Azure Marketplace, curating that, creating offers and plans, deploying PaaS services and keeping those up to date. It's a very specialized offering. But the newest product in the portfolio is Azure Stack HCI. So Azure Stack HCI is a new operating system launched by Microsoft and Azure back in December 2020. It's an operating system that you consume for Azure, and there's a number of benefits that come with that. And it's focused on being an operating system purely, you know, for hyper-converged infrastructure, so really at the host level. And so, you know, features that will come to Storage Space Direct and Hyper-V, they'll come to Azure Stack HCI OS. It's the operating system focused on being the host operating system, and it's the newest one in the family. It's the one that's getting all the attention. It's the one that all these new services are coming to, and it's really kind of setting the tone for the future and where the Azure Stack portfolio is going. Now, the second mechanism is Azure Arc. Yeah, so I said, you know, that's extending Azure governance and management services, also enabling Azure services to run on infrastructure that lives outside of an Azure data center. So what do I mean by that? Well, at Dell, we like to use the examples of, you know, it could be a PowerFlex, one of our PowerFlex infrastructures running in the data center, but it could be, you know, any server that you have, any hyper-converged infrastructure that you have, running in the data center, any virtual machines running on those or Kubernetes clusters. It could be a 2-node, maybe a VxRail, maybe something else running at the edge. But what's really cool is it could also be virtual machines running in Google or AWS. So remember when I said the last point on this slide that sort of ran through the reasons of why hybrid and why multi-cloud? Microsoft are saying, hey, we understand that you might be running some virtual machines or Kubernetes clusters in AWS or in Google. We want you to be able to benefit from our governance and management capabilities. So, let's project that virtual machine that's running in AWS into Azure so that you can use maybe Azure Monitor on it. Maybe you want to include that in your Azure policy so that you've got a view of all of your virtual machines running no matter where they are, and you can have them monitored and managed by Azure policy. Really, really cool stuff that's going on in the hybrid world. And so I'm going to pause there, just double check to see if there's any questions. But next up, we're going to dive into what is Azure Stack HCI in a little bit more detail.
No questions as of yet, Lisa. And just a reminder to everybody, you can put questions in the question box and we'll ask them.
Yeah. Any questions, drop them in the box. I'll pause again maybe after Azure Stack HCI, and we can always have time at the end as well. Okay, so let's talk about what is Azure Stack HCI. Again, we're keeping this quite high level and really getting to grips with the basic concepts here. So first up, what exactly is it? So it's a new purpose-built hyper-converged infrastructure operating system from Microsoft, delivered and consumed as an Azure service. It's really a stripped-down version of Windows Server. So Windows Server is now very much going to be focused on being the guest OS, and Azure Stack HCI is going to be very much focused on being the host OS. And so it's a stripped-down version, has a smaller footprint, therefore smaller attack vector. But the really cool thing about it is because it's delivered as an Azure service, just like any other cloud service that you consume, it will therefore always be kept up to date. So you can wave goodbye to the often painful cycle of Windows Server coming out of support and then having to upgrade to a new version of Windows Server. That problem goes away with Azure Stack HCI OS. So it remains an enterprise class software-defined hyper-converged infrastructure running Hyper-V, running storage spaces direct, and some Azure-inspired networking. At launch, it actually launched with the stretch clustering capability. And this kind of set the tone for things to come because that won't be coming to Windows Server. It is a specific feature and capability for Azure Stack HCI. As I said, it's consumed as an Azure service, so it's consumed at $10 per core per month, or the local equivalent, or your specialized pricing with Microsoft. So yeah, definitely check that out. But next up, it's born hybrid with deep integration into Azure. So when you log into the Azure portal, there's an Azure Stack HCI resource. And we'll come on to some differences with Azure Arc in a little bit, but Azure Stack HCI is where you're going to get the deepest integration at the cluster infrastructure level. Azure Arc for infrastructure is very much just focused on the virtual machine level or the Kubernetes clusters level. With Azure Stack HCI, you will see information about your actual cluster surfaced up into Azure so that you can do a lot more management with it there. So it means that first of all, you can bring Azure innovation to any workloads running on Azure Stack HCI by applying Azure governance constructs like tags and access controls and policies to your on-premises infrastructure and resources, which is pretty cool. And then lastly, which is a really nice part of Azure Stack HCI, is that you can, if you're a Hyper-V user, and you're used to Windows Server and Hyper-V, then you can use familiar management operations and existing skill sets and tools. So you can manage, via Windows Admin Center, via PowerShell, but you also are now able to manage via the Azure portal and step into that world and bring the two together. A quick point here actually on options when it comes to the hardware for Azure Stack HCI. So OEMs were given sort of two options. You could do validated nodes, or you could do the integrated system, or you could do both. Dell went down the integrated system route, and that is because at the end of the day, you're going to be running Azure services on this platform, and validated nodes doesn't really give you much confidence that things will continue to work on that. So I think the integrated system, and there are other OEMs as well who offer the integrated system, but it means that they can really, offer lifecycle management capability on that system, so as to enable customers to be able to focus on the innovation at their fingertips, right? And really focus on actually taking advantage of Azure and Azure capability on-prem, and not necessarily worrying about the hardware. And it's also, if you look at the Azure Stack HCI catalog from Microsoft, Microsoft recommend an integrated system as well. So when to use Azure Stack HCI, what are the use cases? The use cases, unlike Edge and Hub, are quite varied. And this is because you can start with Azure Stack HCI with as little as one node. And then you can build up to 16 nodes in a cluster, 64 nodes in a cluster set, which means it then kind of fits and addresses quite a number of different use cases. So you've got the more traditional use case of modernizing and improving security around the infrastructure that you run within your data center. So modernizing from 3-tier to hyperconverged, beginning to take advantage of Azure Stack HCI operating system and those new capabilities that it brings. But then because of the one node and the sort of 2-node switchless configurations, perfect for those edge use cases, whether it's in a factory or a remote office. Also really cool that you can then, distribute those, maybe you've got them across a country, across a region, but then you get that centralized view in the Azure portal across all your distributed HCI clusters, which is pretty cool. And there's two things that are very specific to Azure Stack HCI itself. So one is that you can run Azure Kubernetes service on Azure Stack HCI. This is specific to Azure Stack HCI. You can't at this moment run Azure Kubernetes service on any other platform via Arc, specific to Azure Stack HCI. The next thing that is very specific to Azure Stack HCI is Azure Virtual Desktop. So Azure Virtual Desktop has been running successfully in Azure for a while now. It took a really big uptake over the last couple of years with everything that's been going on. But that kind of uptake also highlighted some limitations, right? You sometimes still need that sort of that environment running closer to your users and your data. And so what Microsoft has done is said, hey, let's make Azure Virtual Desktop and that VDI environment available on Azure Stack HCI so that it can run closer to the users and closer to the data if that is what's required. There's also an Azure Stack HCI preview right now with Azure Arc, which is all about allowing you to deploy virtual machines from the Azure portal as if they were virtual machines, but deploy them onto an Azure Stack HCI cluster, which is again really great if you have multiple clusters, maybe across different locations, or if you are just moving to Azure more, you're used to being in Azure, you've got other workloads in Azure, you want to be able to do things in the same way. That's a really cool capability. We'll just take a really quick look at sort of how this is built up. This is a nice, what we like to call an architecture slide. So from a Dell perspective, it starts with the AX nodes, as we call them. There are nodes that are specifically designed and architected for Microsoft solutions and for Azure Stack HCI. That allows us to provide solution level support, so hardware and software. Allows us to bring lots of lifecycle management capability and lots of cool other things that we're doing to really integrate with Azure and sort of make the Azure hybrid dreams come true, as I like to say. But basically, you start with your hardware offering. You then consume your operating system through your Azure subscription as you would any other Azure service. And then on top, you can go ahead and run your virtual machines, Windows, Linux. Bear in mind, the Windows virtual machines do need to be licensed accordingly. So with Azure Stack HCI, it's not the same as Windows Data Center in that you get unlimited guest OS licenses for Windows virtual machines. You can add that on through a new subscription that was recently launched, so you can license all the physical cores of Azure Stack HCI, which then provides you with the unlimited guest OS licenses. So you can do that, but you can also go ahead and deploy Azure Kubernetes service on-prem, right? And then that opens up a whole new world. You can then start to deploy Azure services via Azure Arc. And you can manage Azure Stack HCI from Windows Admin Center, both locally and it's in preview from the Azure portal. You can use PowerShell if that's what you've been used to. You can also start to use the Azure portal and some of the capabilities there. So that's Azure Stack HCI. I'll pause for any questions before I go into Azure Arc.
And we did get a few questions actually. Is there a lab for HCI on Azure for POC or something?
Yeah, so if you want to test out Azure Stack HCI in a sort of lab format, you can test it in Azure, you could test it on nested virtualization, you could test it on your laptop, and what I would highly recommend is that you go and check out MS Labs on GitHub or Dell Geos on GitHub. Big shout out to Jaromir Kasper, also look him up on Twitter. He has been working on a whole bunch of labs, PowerShell scripts, scenarios, etc. that allow you to test Azure Stack HCI on any hardware that you have available that fits the minimum requirements, but lots of different options there to go through. So go and check out MS Labs on GitHub and Dell Geos on GitHub.
Perfect, great. Do you want to, there's one more, do you want to, will we answer that now or go to the end?
We can go with it now if you want, yeah.
Sure. How does Azure HCI handle identities and access management?
Yeah, so you would use the same controls that you use with Azure. So your role-based access controls within Azure would apply to Azure Stack HCI.
Perfect, that's it for now, thank you.
Okay, awesome. There's a whole area in that we could go into, but there's a lot of really great additional controls that you can bring to Azure Stack HCI by utilizing role-based access control and identity management from Azure Identity. And then you could do a whole bunch of different stuff, like depending on which resource groups you put your Azure Stack HCI cluster into, you know, by using Azure policy and tags, etc. You can get quite granular on who can do what. Okay, next up, what is Azure Arc? Okay, so Azure Arc is the is the one that's getting all the attention right now, and quite rightly so. It's a really, really cool whole new world, really, that Microsoft are entering and that they are creating. So let's take a step back and think about, right, what is Azure Arc aiming to do? So it's a set of technologies that extends Azure services and management to infrastructure that live outside of Azure, so that customers can build, operate, manage all of the resources from traditional to cloud native to at the edge in a consistent way. That's what it's aiming to do. It's also aiming to help accelerate innovation across hybrid and multi-cloud environments, to simplify management, to provide consistent app development, and also provide the ability to take advantage of Azure services wherever you need to run them, which I think is the coolest. So first up, if you've got workloads running outside of Azure, then Azure Arc is aiming to allow you to centrally manage all of those in a consistent way in Azure. So whether it's Windows or Linux virtual machines, SQL servers, Kubernetes clusters, it wants to be able to bring those together to allow you to govern and organize and inventory assets in a standardized way and get central visibility from the single pane of glass that is the Azure portal. And this is all to help with sort of governance and compliance standards. Next up is that Azure Arc really wants to help devs build cloud native apps anywhere without worrying too much about what infrastructure that's running on, and being able to enable organizations to leverage cloud native app development practices when they're developing applications on premises. So taking advantage of those DevOps techniques to deploy and manage specifically, Kubernetes applications at scale. And lastly, the coolest area that I think is about enabling organizations and customers to take advantage and run Azure services anywhere. And so just a point on this, actually, to run Azure services, we will come on to this, but to run Azure services such as, so Azure SQL Managed Instance is currently available. To run that on premises, you just need to run a Kubernetes cluster. So you need to run any CNCF flavor of Kubernetes is supported. A number of them are validated, so Tanzu, OpenShift, Red Hat, etc. Obviously AKS. You run a Kubernetes cluster, that becomes a target ID in Azure Resource Manager as a deployment target for SQL Managed Instance. So SQL Managed Instance is a PaaS service that's been, used by tons of people in Azure to give them a more managed service version of SQL. But prior to Azure Arc, you can only take advantage of that if you're running your workloads in Azure. What if you need to keep your databases on-prem? This helps you do that, which is pretty cool. So that's the kind of 3 main aims of Azure Arc. I like to categorize Azure Arc into 2 main buckets, 2 main categories. So the first one, right, is again, if you have those Azure Arc, if you have those virtual machines, those Kubernetes clusters running outside of Azure, it's about projecting them up into Azure so that you can start to take advantage of Azure governance and management capabilities like tags, resource groups, having them be monitored as part of your Azure policy, for instance. So bucket number 1 is projecting infrastructure that lives outside of Azure into Azure. Bucket number 2 is bringing those services from Azure on-prem to run in your data center or at the edge. So those are the 2 buckets, and what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the first bucket, we're going to see what's available today, and then we're going to look at the second bucket for Azure Arc. So let's take a look at Azure Arc enabled infrastructure. So today, this largely falls into a further 2 buckets, shall we say, and that is Azure Arc enabled servers and Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. So first up, Azure Arc enabled servers, has support for Windows Server, wide range of Linux operating systems such as SUSE and Red Hat, and we'll go into this in a little bit. And next up is Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes with support for a wide range of distributions, so any CNCF certified Kubernetes cluster. But like I said, the Azure Arc team have worked with a few to validate those, and we'll see those in a minute. So those are the 2 main buckets under Azure Arc enabled infrastructure. So Azure Arc enabled servers, you can onboard a server which lives outside of Azure. So a Windows virtual machine running on an infrastructure on-prem, a Linux virtual machine running in AWS, bare metal, yeah? You can onboard that server into the Azure portal. Once you've onboarded the virtual machine using an agent-based technology, so you need to deploy an agent, you can then, like I said before, and you'll sense there's a big theme here, right? It's about bringing that Azure management and governance, getting that single view of all of your virtual machines or your assets, and being able to use tags, resource groups, etc. That's been so successful and popular within Azure. In addition to that, you can also then deploy some Azure virtual machine extensions to non-Azure Windows and Linux VMs, such as update management for Windows virtual machines. So you can start to use update management for Windows virtual machines that aren't even running in Azure, and I believe that's for free as well. You can also then start to use Azure monitoring for those virtual machines. When you do consume services like Azure monitoring, you will be charged as if you were using that on a virtual machine in Azure, yeah, because it's that capability that you're using from that service, just like Azure Policy as well, or Azure Defenders for Windows, etc. So there's lots of different things you can start to add on. I mentioned Azure Defender, Azure Policy, Azure Monitor, Azure Sentinel, Azure Security Center. So if you're using Azure Security Center in Azure, you can start to have your on-premises virtual machines pulled into that. Next up is the Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. So you can attach and configure a Kubernetes cluster outside of Azure. Once it's connected, it will be represented in the Azure Resource Manager with a unique ID and will be then placed in an Azure subscription and resource group, which obviously you would choose, meaning that it can, again, there's a theme, receive tags, just like any other Azure resource. Once connected, you can then view and monitor the clusters, again, using Azure Monitor for containers. You can enforce threat protection for clusters using Azure Defender for containers, and apply Azure policy definitions as well. You can also start to apply configuration using GitOps based configuration management. And remember, Kubernetes forms the basis for any Azure Arc enabled data and application services to drop on top of. So you can start to create custom locations as target locations to deploy those Azure services, which is pretty cool. Oh, and I should say the ones at the bottom there are all the ones that have been validated with the Azure Arc team. One thing as well that's in preview right now is, so just like Azure Arc for Azure Stack HCI is in preview to enable you to deploy and manage virtual machines from Azure as if they were Azure virtual machines on Azure Stack HCI. There's also in preview right now, Azure Arc enabled VMware for vSphere, which means that you can perform lifecycle management operations at the virtual machine level. So you can start, stop, create, scale, resize, delete any of your vSphere virtual machines. Then all those activities can be governed by Azure role-based access control, so that you can create boundaries around who can provision virtual machines on demand, who can delete, etc. Again, aiming for Azure Portal to become that single pane of glass. So that's Azure Arc enabled infrastructure. Before I go on to Azure Arc enabled services, is there any questions?
There are a few questions here, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Are Azure HCI providing support for infrastructure as code, for example, allowing teams to deploy infrastructure, for example, any module for Terraform?
Let me think that one through. So you can use, depending on what you're running on Azure Stack HCI, so you can use ARM-based templates to deploy services and applications on Azure Stack HCI. In terms of infrastructure as code, you can use PowerShell, etc. scripts to deploy as you normally would. And I think with the preview of being able to deploy and run Azure virtual machines as if they were on Azure Stack HCI, then you'll be able to use infrastructure of codes concepts like Terraform to be able to do that, because ultimately you would be doing that in Azure, and all that would be happening is you'd be targeting a custom location, which would be your Azure Stack HCI. So yes.
Okay, thank you. One more. Why do I need Azure Arc to run AKS when I can run AKS directly from Azure? I don't get it. What role is Azure Arc playing when running Kubernetes here?
Okay. So Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes is not running the Kubernetes distribution. Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes is just saying, hey, I have this Kubernetes cluster here. I would like to project that into Azure so that I can apply tags and resource groups. I can monitor it, etc. So it's not to run it as a distribution. It's to manage it as another infrastructure, as an infrastructure. AKS that you can run in Azure if you want. Grand, continue to do that. If you need to run AKS on-prem, then you can do that on Azure Stack HCI.
Thank you. I think that's it for now.
Okay, awesome. Azure Arc enabled services. Let's go on to this then. So this is a really cool area. Like I said, I think it's the one that I find the coolest. Maybe, I just need to get out more, who knows? But the fact that we can now take Azure services and run them, where we need to on the infrastructure of our choice, I find very cool. So there's again a few buckets, yeah. So under Azure Arc enabled services, you've got Azure Arc enabled application services, which we see here. We've got Azure Arc enabled data services, and we've got Azure Arc enabled machine learning coming. And there could be more if I've not caught up with some of my announcements today, but let's see. So in the Azure Arc enabled application services, you've got a bunch of, basically Microsoft and Azure are focused on the popular PaaS services in Azure and focused on enabling them to run on premises. So you've got Azure App Services, which will allow you to quickly build, deploy, and manage web apps and APIs. There's Azure Functions, which you can use to build event-driven applications with built-in bindings and deploy the same code anywhere. You've got Azure Logic Apps, so you can connect applications, data, and devices anywhere. Azure API Management, Azure Event Grid. These are all in public preview just now. I'm not sure when they will come out of public preview. Microsoft tends to coincide these things with their big events, so I would see a lot happening at Ignite later this year. But that's Azure Arc enabled application services. Azure Arc enabled data services consists of Azure SQL managed instance, which is generally available, and Azure database for PostgreSQL, which is currently in preview. This is really cool. I think allowing to take advantage of those database PaaS services on-prem and really modernize databases that need to remain on premises or at the edge, take advantage of that always current at a service type service and run those on premises. And finally, we've got Azure Arc enabled machine learning. So these two services, Azure Machine Learning for training and Azure Machine Learning for inferencing, are currently in public preview. This is a relatively new area, but again, I think is quite powerful in terms of taking advantage of those cloud native innovations and capabilities and being able to enhance your on-premises workloads and data using them. I think this will be huge for those edge location scenarios. And then, so basically just to finish up here, as you can see, Azure is very much driving to be Azure as hybrid by design. There's a lot of chat out there as to whether this was in the works, whether it was planned, or whether they've just realized. I think if you look back at the way that Microsoft have released new capabilities from really Windows Server 2016 forward to Azure Stack HCI, Azure Stack Hub back in 2017, they always were driving towards Azure being hybrid by design. And I think that Azure provides one of the most consistent and holistic hybrid and multi-cloud offerings out there. It's still new, it's still evolving, lots are still in public preview, but it's getting there. So the goal of Azure Arc, Azure Stack HCI is to meet you where you are with your existing investments, with your workflows that do need to remain on premises or at the edge. It's to provide consistency, but also flexibility. Be able to take advantage of Azure services, but run them on the infrastructure that you want. Run them on the infrastructure that your system administrators are used to running. One of the really cool use cases that we see at Dell currently is being able to bring teams together. So dev teams and ops teams, we all know, have very traditionally lived in silos and don't necessarily understand where each other's coming from. They have different requirements, and sometimes that can cause people to knock heads and sort of prevent progress in moving forward. What we are seeing currently is a huge opportunity for infrastructure teams to still pick the infrastructure that they need, that they have skills for, that allow them to serve both their developer community, but other internal IT and other regions, be able to have that control, but then use Azure Arc to deploy and allow their developers to use those Azure services that they want to use, and to use those consistent sort of DevOps techniques and tools. So it's a really cool space. It's still evolving. There's still a lot of work to be done. But yeah, I would say this is why Azure is hybrid by design. Do we have any final questions?
Yeah, there's just one more there. If anybody else has a question, there's still a little bit of time if you want to type it into the questions box. The one that I have is, what is the future of Hyper-V in the next 10 years? Will it survive? Since lots of tech giants are preferring cloud IaaS and cloud security, as you or MS MVP in our enterprise is hybrid and major resources is on Hyper-V.
Yeah, so I don't know where it's going to be in 10 years because I don't have a crystal ball. And things do change. And I think, you know, especially since the last 2 years, they're changing at an even more rapid pace. As people were kind of driven to adopt different ways of working and maybe the cloud in a little bit more. But what I would say is that Azure Stack HCI operating system is built on Hyper-V. So it's built on Hyper-V, it's built on Storage Spaces Direct. That is still very relevant. When Azure Stack HCI operating system launched, it launched with stretched clustering for Hyper-V. And so I think that as long as hybrid has a future, which it absolutely does, as long as on-premises has a future, which it absolutely does, Hyper-V has a future. Microsoft said back at Ignite 2019 that they foresee hybrid to be the end state for the majority of their customers. So they're no longer saying it's kind of like a stop off on the road to full cloud adoption. They're saying that hybrid they see as their end state. And so, you know, Hyper-V is still very much the technology that underpins the on-premises and hybrid version of Azure. Azure Stack HCI operating system, if you look at it in terms of against Windows Server, it's really similar. It's very similar. And so, yeah, I think it's got a strong future. I think hybrid and on-premise is here to stay. And I think as long as that's the case, Hyper-V will be around. In fact, actually, Microsoft just released, I think it was late last year, they released a new set of certifications for Windows Server and hybrid administrators. So there's still, you know, there's a recognition that those skills are still very much needed, and that actually a lot of people who have rushed to adopt the cloud but now need to be in hybrid, or people who are new to the industry maybe don't have that expertise. And so there's a big focus on bringing that all together. Hyper-V knowledge is very much needed if you want to run Azure Stack HCI OS on-prem.
Great, thank you. A few people asking if you would be able to share the slides.
Yeah, sure, I can share the slides. I can absolutely do that. Either, yeah, through yourself.
I was going to say, if you send them to me, I can put them up on the website with the recording.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone has any questions, just reach out to me on Twitter, Lisa at the Edge. And if I can't answer them, because I can't answer all of them, I'm not actually a techie. I keep saying that and getting into trouble for it, but I'm not hands-on. But I have worked very closely in this space for the last like 8 years, and I'm very passionate about it, and I will do my best to find someone who can answer your question.
Thank you. And there's one more question in here. I'm struggling now using Azure Managed Cluster via SDK in my Python Jupyter notebook. It's really not easy to use Azure resources from on-premise notebooks using SDK. Is Azure Arc enabled Azure Machine Learning providing anything easier to use Azure deployed cluster, or it's only targeting managed on-premise cluster?
I will need to check on that one. 110% I would need to check. I would imagine that, especially for Azure machine learning services, that they would be aiming to have it as consistent as possible for those who have been used to working with those services in Azure, and allowing you to use your notebooks. But I'll need to look into that. If you want to send me a message on Twitter or LinkedIn, I will try and find someone that can help you with that.
Super, that's great. That's all the questions we have, Lisa. Thanks so much for taking the time. It was really great.
Awesome, thank you. I thought I was going to go over time, so I kind of rushed at the end, so apologies to anybody for that.
You're flying it, and we got loads of questions in as well, so that was great.
Good, I'm glad.
Yeah. So thanks as well, everybody, for attending today. It was a fantastic webinar, I think you'll agree. It will be added to the Resource Centre, and when Lisa sends on the slides, I'll pop them up as well. Join us again tomorrow for more webinars. Find out more on SharePointEurope.com Azure Week. Thanks again. Bye now.